Hello, everybody, and welcome to comments on Chapter 2, Classical Approaches in the Miller book. The metaphor used to help us understand the classical approach in this chapter is the machine metaphor, which is to say that organizations run like machines. People are the cogs in the machine. That's a sprocket type looking thing, and the idea is that people are put into the machine, and the tasks that people do make the machine work. There are four key tenets of the machine metaphor, or basic ideas, or basic concepts of the machine metaphor that help us understand how classical management operates. The first is the importance of specialization, that we are shifting at this time when we see classical management coming into mainstream usage. We're moving away from other types of industry, such as the cottage industry of one family or one person makes an entire product from start to finish. That historically is how it was done, and Henry Ford is really the one that's given a lot of credit for um, bringing in the assembly line, which lends itself beautifully to classical management because when Henry Ford has the men push the car and have other men working on the car as it's moving, you start to see how one person could be in charge of putting these three rivets or bolts or nuts or what have you on the car, and all of a sudden we have each person doing their special job. um, and more so, the first point here about the machine metaphor is that specialization happens at the worker level, and that there's a clear division between the workers and the managers. In the true sense of classical management, um, the workers do the laboring and the management does the strategic thinking, the planning. They're the ones that are smart enough, are educated, and they're able to think through the entire process and know what needs to be done. And they're the ones in charge of making sure all the resources there, everything's there that the workers need. So all the workers have to do is come in and work. So they have a very specialized position in that their task is very specific. Management has the strategic leadership, and they must make sure that everything is there for the laborers to do their job. Um, we see that processes under classical management become standardized. So standardization is important so that we know how each task should get done and about how long it should take. We also know that workers in the classical management uh, structure and approach to organizing are replaceable. Again, they are cogs. Now, a cog is a sprocket looking object, and the idea is that when the cog wears out, which can be the grooves are worn from repeated contact, the tines or the ends of the sprocket are worn down, which generally is the case. If you think of a sprocket on a motorcycle where a chain runs over it, or a sprocket in a chainsaw where the chain runs over that sprocket, um, the ends of the sprocket begin to get really worn down, and eventually it causes too much play in whatever the machine is, and the sprocket has to be replaced. And so we know that we can replace workers, that we can stick anybody in there and they should be able to do the job because we've simplified and specialized the job enough that it doesn't take someone with a high education and um, strong critical thinking skills to think through the job and do the job. And the other beautiful thing about classical management, if done well, is predictability. And that is, we should be able to predict, one, the amount of resources needed to go into creating this product, right? How much product do I need to make this faucet, this bathtub? How much product do I need to make this tire, make this electronic part? The other part of predictability is we now can predict how much output we should have at within any given time. So management can say at the end of this month we'll have made X amount of units, and they'll know how many units they've made. In classical management approaches, this allows management to plan for when they have busier seasons, when they have slowdowns. This is often where you'll see a week or two layoff during slow times, or maybe even a month layoff where laborers get laid off because there isn't any work. ideally, that's not the best outcome, right? If you're the owner of this company and you want to run this company, you want to be able to predict your workflows and maybe slow things down a little bit or speed them up depending upon what your horizon or future looks like, so that you keep your employees employed and you keep them producing products and good at the predictable rate that you need them or want them to. And so it's really important that we think about, we see that predictability, replaceability, standardization, division of labor, and the importance of specialization of management and workers and what workers do. These are really the key tenets of not only machine metaphor, but of classical management. Here's a little video, and I'll be obviously putting the slide deck out there for you, but it's a funny video of Charlie Chaplin. We won't watch the whole thing, so I don't think it's needed for this discussion. Um, but it's the idea that Charlie is working in this factory and he's supposed to do this one job, and then the fellows next to him do another job, right? And the machine just goes and goes and goes, and the conveyor belt keeps coming and coming and coming, and parts keep coming, and he has to keep up with it. That's the idea of classical management. Everything works like a machine. One of the first theorists that Miller talks about and is really important for understanding classical management theory, the three theories she talks about in this chapter are common in many management books, is Henry Fayol. And Fayol is really one of the first people he didn't, um, sit down and do research and say, okay, this is how the research says, it ought to be done. There wasn't research at the time. He wasn't being descriptive in that he wasn't describing what was currently happening at the time. At the time, Fayol was sitting down and he was prescribing. So Fayol's ideas are what we call prescriptive. He was prescribing here's how I think we ought to do classical management. And he had his ideas of elements of management, about planning and organizing. So determining the best way to reach your goals, and then organizing all of your resources, right? People, material goods, those are resources. Organizing your resources so that you can get the job done. What we see is that Fayol says, there has to be some form of command, and that management sets the task. That managers are responsible for saying, here's the tasks that need to be done. That management is responsible for coordinating, so coordination is the other element here. That managers are responsible to make sure that activities are harmonized into a single whole. That means if we have to have somebody stamping out sheet metal into a rough rectangular part, they have to get their job done first before the next person down the line maybe stamps it over a mold, and now we have this shape that takes place in the sheet metal, and then we have to eventually have the finishers, right? And maybe they grind it smooth, they buff it smooth so the sheet metal shines nicely, right? If that doesn't all take place, we don't have the coordination. We're not going to achieve our goal, which is producing our goods in a predictable way, right? And so it's up to management, and management must control what is happening. They must say, okay, what is our goal and what are we doing to get to that goal? And does our actions or our activities match what we want to achieve as our goal? And if that's not happening, Fayol argues it's up to the management to make that happen, to make changes. Uh, in this scenario, workers are not seen as highly intelligent. They are not seen as knowing the larger picture. They just come in, they do their job. During the time that Fayol was developing these ideas, laborers were not educated people like they tend to be today. Today, everybody has a high school degree at least at a bare minimum, and then even then, you're going to find in factories and classical places of classical management, which are actually quite abundant still today, you're going to find people with educations, with associate's degrees, technical degrees, even bachelor's degrees, graduate degrees of some type. And so today we have a different workforce, a much more educated workforce than we did during Fayol's time. He has some key principles of management: power, reward, and attitude. And he wants managers and leaders to follow these principles. And he says, if you do, this is how to run an effective company with a classical management style. When we talk about principles of management, he's talking about a scalar chain, and that there has to be a sort of chain of command, and that everything chains out from there. And so one person is in charge, and then there are people below that person, and people below that person, and people below that person. That there's a unity of command, that one employee only reports up to one person. That a specific employee would not report to multiple people. You would argue that would be confusing, that would not be efficient, and that's not what we want to do. Unity of direction. The classical management approach is very top down, in that the managers at the top give the orders, and the people at the bottom are the laborers, the workers. They carry out the work. We talked about division of labor a little bit already. We're dividing the labor. Managers do the strategic thinking. Laborers do the physical work, and that's divided. And it doesn't really, there's no reason to switch that back and forth. Talks about there's order, there's control. Nothing is left to a guess. Everything is thought out. Classical management is about optimizing all of your resources to get the most out of them. And then how much control? It shouldn't be that you have one person overseeing the entire organization. That's just not, especially for large organizations. If you have an organization of 5 people, okay, that's possible, right? It's effective that one person could oversee the 5, but you're not going to have one person overseeing 50 or 100 people. Generally, in classical management structures, you see teams or lines, they may call them. And so someone may say, hey, I work on the Clorox line, and there may be 12 or 15 people during that shift that work on the Clorox line. And they'll have maybe one manager above them, or a manager and assistant manager. And so what happens is, and what the important part is that the management in this structure can know full well what each one of their employees is doing at any given time. They're able to see them. They're able to look and see what they're doing. They're able to look up and see their production rates, see how much they're making, how many units per hour, if that's part of the measures of control. And so it's important that we see that there's lots of control in classical management. And Fayol believed in control. Fayol believed in maximizing, right, your resources, your people, your material resources, and then the process as well. Fayol said power is centralized, and that there's authority and responsibility, and that there's discipline. And so centralization of power, if you think back to what we've already talked about, that power's at the top, right? The decision makers are at the top, and they push down. Their communication goes from top to the bottom. They tell the workers what to do. Responsibility, Fayol would argue, is left to the managers. Managers are responsible to make sure that resources are in place and that processes are happening in the efficient way that they are meant to happen. Managers may give authority to others to take initiative to do something, so watch over somebody else. They may give authority to other people that are part of the management structure, so that they can manage these 3 people, so that the other manager doesn't have to. The other manager can go manage another 3 people, right? And this is a really great point that I always like to point out when we're thinking about authority and responsibility. I think as students who are learning about organizing and organizational communication, and you're really learning how to become managers and how to grow into your own as far as being a manager, if you are the manager and you are the leader of your team at work, even if it's a 1-person team, if it's you and one other person, you are ultimately responsible for what happens and the outcomes of your team. You can delegate the authority to your team members to give them the authority they need to do their work, but ultimately you are responsible for what happens and what gets done. We can think of certain situations like the Enron situation, where Ken Lay was the CEO of Enron, and he made the argument Enron did some poor business practices. They were essentially scamming and scheming. They were cooking the books, making it look like they were making more money and more profits than they actually were. And Ken Lay, he was brought in late. He was a late replacement as far as CEO of Enron. And when the whole Enron situation went down, people said, well, what about the CEO of this company? isn't he responsible for what happened? And Ken Lay's argument was, how am I to know what's going on in the accounting room? How am I to know everything that the accounting people are doing? Now, later on, it came out that there was a woman that had emailed him and had notified higher ups at the organization that this was going on. But it was also found out that a lot of people in power at that organization were making money off of the scheming process. Ken Lay died before ever having to go to court or face any type of legal ramification. So that'll never happen. But it's the idea to avoid those situations. You believe in yourself that you are ultimately responsible for whatever happens, and you give other people the authority to act on your behalf and make decisions. But if they do a poor job, you're responsible for that poor outcome. And of course, Fayol says discipline. There has to be discipline. And Henry Ford's example of the assembly line is no different. He used plenty of discipline in his organizations, giving only set amount of breaks for employees and making sure that if they were going to the bathroom and on that toilet for too long, the old saying is somebody would come by and stomp on your foot and let you know to get off the toilet and get back to work. So highly disciplined and regimented. Principles of organizational reward, and the word here is remuneration. All that means is to pay or reward your employees. And Fayol sounds kind of harsh to the workers, but he also believed that you should pay your workers well, that there should be an equitable return for their employment. This runs rather counter to what we see today in a lot of classical organizations. It's not uncommon to see in warehouse work or in other factory work, in line work. I mean, the higher ends of pay scales on line work today is about $20 an hour, um, which that is not really, in the grand scheme of things, a lot of money. You're talking what, $40,000 gross, take about 22% off for health insurance and all those other things off of $40,000, and you're looking at closer to $32,000 a year um, that people have to live on, that they have to pay their rent, their mortgage, what have you, all their bills. And so we've seen that decline. We've seen over the years that CEO salaries have increased over 800%, and that laborer salaries have been nowhere in line with that. They're much lower. And so that's part of our political debates and discussions today is what is this rebalancing and what should it look like, and at what point do we say something? So Fayol said equitable return. Henry Ford did the same thing. You may have worked really hard at Henry Ford's plant, but you also made enough money, and for many people had housing provided, that you could live easily. And the idea fails the same, and Henry Ford followed this idea, is that you want your employees well taken care of because you don't want them worrying about how are they going to pay their medical bills. How are they going to cover their house payment? How are they going to afford a car? Which is counter to what everything Henry Ford stood for. He was the one that modernized the car making process so he could sell cars to the average person. Prior to Henry Ford, the average person could not afford to buy a car. And so he wanted to make sure, just as Fayol would argue, that you want your employees well paid. And so we can make the argument that we're not seeing that today, and that's one of the current downfalls. But there is value, I mean, if you think about $15 an hour, and to get $15 an hour, that's not a lot of money. Um, the other aspect of this is Fayol did argue that tenure, that you want your employees to feel safe and secure, and that they're going to have a job as long as they perform in a manner that meets your expectations. And so Fayol said, you want employees to have a tenure, to feel safe and secure, and you want them to be able to come to work and know that they're going to have a job. Post 2008, when we had the big crash, we saw that. We had unemployment numbers up near 11%, almost 12%. We had a lot of laborers displaced. Even here in the state of Wisconsin, we had what was called at the time a displaced workers program that enabled people who lost their job to go to college, the state or tech school, 2 years of education. The state would pay for that and give some other financial subsidies as well, since we had such high unemployment at the time. Now we're closer to 3-4%, a much better place for us to be. And it'll be interesting to see if over time we see wages continue to increase for laborers or if they're going to remain where they are. Fayol said principles of attitude that you really want to subordinate your own interests and you really want to have the interests of the company. And you see this in situations where, for example, people that work for General Motors, maybe they're very GM proud. Um, my significant other's father worked for GM most of his adult life, and for a long time, he was kind of the kind of guy. He said, if you don't have a GM car, don't park it in my driveway, right? Really proud of GM. Would go into work sick because that's what you do, right? Um, you want to build that sort of esprit de corps. And I have an example of the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps has their motto, Semper Fi, or Semper Fidelis is the long term. Uh, Semper Fidelis means always faithful, and that is you're always giving it up to the Marine Corps. You're always going to do what's best for the Marine Corps, not necessarily what's best for you. And Fayol really wanted organizations to encourage this because he thought, this will get us the best return, of course, and the best workers, and people will show up, and we'll have this really great synergy among our people. And you can see that today when people are really proud and they say, I work for GM and I'm really proud of General Motors, right? That's what they're trying to do with principles of organizational attitude. The next theorist that Miller likes to talk about is Weber. And Weber had the theory of bureaucracy, a German sociologist in the late 19th, 20th century. He had his ideas of bureaucracy, and that he said there should be a clearly defined hierarchy, right? Again, educated people at the top making the decisions, a division of labor, meaning that the laborers, the uneducated people, the workers, they should be doing the physical task, and of course, a centralization of power and decision making. So very similar to Fayol, right? Some of the more uh, commonly recognized aspects of Weber is that he argued that there's some ideas about um, a relatively closed system, and that classical management systems don't have to deal with a lot of outside influence. They don't change much, is really what it comes down to. And if you look today at many factories and organizations that use classical management, you see they don't need to change much. Many factories and organizations were still running Windows 95 and older versions of Windows because they haven't had a need to change. To help remedy this, you saw that Windows came out and pushed out Windows 10 and said, you know what? We'll give it for free. We'll give it away for free as an update because they were seeing large numbers of people not updating to newer versions of Windows. And they really want to get people using the newest platform. And for organizations, if you think about it, a lot of organizations were 95 or Windows XP was very common still. It would cost organizations so much money to update to newer versions of Windows that they're willing to stay on the older systems to save in that cost. Now, as we see cloud computing becoming more prevalent, I think you're going to see more and more organizations, and especially with the free Windows 10 upgrade, make that shift because now as we see more capability of cloud technology, for example, an automated organization like an assembly line for microprocessing chips, for example, they now can have technicians diagnose problems using cloud technology. Those technicians are nowhere physically near the plant, but they're able to now do it remotely, which saves the company a lot of money. They don't have to fly a technician out. The technician doesn't have to be there. It makes life a lot easier. So relatively closed systems, classical management still looks much the same as it did. So not much change. There's some ideas about technical cores and the idea that you get really good at something and you keep doing it and you keep doing it and you keep doing it. You develop this technical expertise on how to make toilets and faucets and things of that nature. Um, and again, Weber said, hey, got to have rules. People have to follow rules and there has to be authority. The people in charge make the decisions. They communicate down to those that are workers, and they tell the workers what to do. Now, Weber is well known for his thoughts on leadership here, and that he says authority is based on these three grounds: traditional, legitimate authority, charismatic authority, and rational legal authority. So now, rational legal authority, this is the most common. You are appointed, you have, for all the rational reasons and thoughts and ideas, you're the one that is the one that should be appointed to um, this position, right? And so you've been given it. Charismatic authority, someone that is very charismatic, someone that will woo you, someone that will help motivate you to um, take up the position in their organization, right? Um, that's someone that has that charisma, that's able to talk their way into it. And traditional, you're born into it. You're part of a family. This family has owned this company for years, and your father has run it. And now that you're the next oldest sibling, you're going to take control of the organization. So you have this legitimate authority because you were sort of born into it. You're the next one in line. One of the most influential people about that related to classical management is Frederick Taylor. Frederick Taylor came up with scientific management theory. Um, he, was a business person early on. He had a concentration on the micro level. So where these other two theories, Weber and Fayol, their focus is more on the macro picture, the big picture. Frederick Taylor comes along. He says, no, 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 no. Let's look at exactly what associates or workers are doing, and let's really make sure that this is the most effective way for us to do business. And so what Taylor argues is that there's one best way to do a job. And so he had his time motion studies, right? And that's what you're going to read about. And where he would sit down and figure out, for example, he had one worker who was loading pig iron into a rail car. And he figured out that if he put ramps up to the rail car in sort of a U-shaped pattern, he could have the worker grab a piece of iron, carry it up to the rail car, throw it in the rail car, and then walk down the other side of the ramp in that U-shaped pattern. And he realized that he could increase productivity significantly. He did other studies. For example, he assessed how a waitress would pour water from a water glass and determined the best way for her to pour the water into the glass that's the most efficient. What the ideas of this come out to be is that we really start to see an emphasis on the person job fit, is that you have specific criteria, you have specific way that you want the task done, so you want that person to do that task. Now, Frederick Taylor, uh, he thought workers were not intelligent, were not smart, could not think for themselves. He thought that management were the ones that were educated. They were the ones that had the ideas, that had the strategic thinking capabilities. And so he really saw laborers in a really negative way, as they were just sort of like these human bodies that just were supposed to do the work. They weren't intelligent enough to handle the work on their own. These underlying thoughts of classical management, Weber, Fayol, and especially Taylor, are very present today in a lot of organizations. And in fact, they dominate, even in non-classical organizations, these tenets still dominate, in that you have to have a leader, and that you report up to your leader, and that there's a chain of command, and that big decisions ought to be made by those higher up in the chain of command, and that only less severe or less risky, mitigate risk, right? Less risky decisions are made by frontline employees. And so even in non-classical management areas, we still see a strong influence of classical management today. And we still see, a lot of people will say, well, classical management is dead. I would argue no. And in fact, you still see classical management almost everywhere you go. Um, You look at McDonald's, for example, they break the work down into specialized parts. You have somebody working the grill, you have people making the sandwiches, you have people working at the registers, and then you have people backing the people at the registers that are not on the cook side, they're on the register side, but they don't necessarily work on the registers, right? And so that's a specialization of labor. You have a division of labor that management does the scheduling and those types of activities, and that the workers do the work. And so we still see this in a lot of places. Um, uh, Taylor's ideas, training workers in a manner suggested by time and motion studies. So we got to train people that way, and that there are inherent differences between management and workers, right? Managers best suited for thinking, workers best suited for laboring. That he did argue and believe that scientific management should correct past problems, and the problem of uneven work should be eliminated. Taylor did not want uneven workflows. The idea, again, of classical management is that we keep a steady workflow. That piece rate should be based on a minimum standard set. Uh, Taylor did, he didn't want, and this was part of the problem, and some of the problems back in the day, where managers would say, oh, you should be able to make um, 20 pieces an hour. And then Frederick Taylor would come along and do his study and find out, well, no, that's just not feasible for them to do 20 pieces an hour. They can only do 10. And Taylor would argue that should be the standard then, that we don't want management setting these unrealistic standards because we don't want our employees using systematic soldiering. And that is, if the employees are angry, they all decide to work slower, right? And it's called the work slowdown. And so they have this work slowdown, and then that's their way of getting back at the management. And so Taylor said, no, that's not the most efficient way. Again, classical management is about using the most efficient, doing work in the most efficient way, using your resources of human capital, using your material resources, and getting the most out of them as you can. And so here's a table, and this is in your book, gives us an idea of the communication flow. It's a top-down communication flow. Communication is generally formal and written. If you think about it, a lot of laborers don't have email addresses at their work. It's not like their boss is going to email them. That's not going to happen. So if you think about how they communicate with their employees, a lot of times information is posted by the punch clock, because that's where a lot of the employees go to punch in and out. They're going to be there every shift. They're going to see it twice. There's probably a billboard near the punch clock that communicates valuable information to them. And so that's the type of communication you're going to see in these organizations. And I just wanted to end here with a little discussion of, think about how you see classical management in today's organizations. I mentioned the McDonald's example. I also argue that you're going to see classical management undertones in many organizations that are attempting not to be classically run. But our mantra, our mindset in the United States is very much rooted in classical management approaches. And it's really hard for organizations to break free from that. It's really hard for organizations to realize that shorter work weeks tend to be more productive for our employees, that giving lots of flexibility to employees, for example, working at home. I work at home myself. I don't go into an office. Actually helps employees manage their time better so they can get more work done. But we're so rooted in the tenets of classical management theory that we believe that employees have to be in the physical location, the same location, and they have to be there so I know that my employees are working. It's just not the case, right? And so that's a gist of classical management. So to take away from it, I think you should know the machine metaphor. You should know the 4 tenets of the machine metaphor. You should have an idea of what Fayol, Weber, and Taylor have to say about classical management. And you should be able to see the similarities across all 3 approaches because they're all rooted in the classical management concepts. And just know that classical management isn't dead, and often it guides our thinking about how we organize ourselves and how we organize other people, and that maybe we need to make sure we're not making some bad assumptions that are based on classical management. I hope this gives you some insight into classical management theory, and that if you have any questions, feel free to contact me at any time. Thank you.